On October 25, 1888, in Woodchester, Virginia, Richard E. Byrd was born. His father, Richard Byrd Sr., was a prominent lawyer, and his mother, Eleanor Boiling Byrd, came from a socially influential family. Byrd's family has deep roots in America, going back to early colonial American history. He was a descendant of the First Family of Virginia, which was a political dominant group in British colony of Virginia, later the Commonwealth of Virginia. They descended from early European colonists who primarily settled at Jamestown, Williamsburg, the Northern Neck, and alongside the James River. This family background contributed to a sense of duty and adventure. Since Byrd's family was established in Virginia for a long time, this meant Byrd had a well-off, educated environment, which allowed access to excellent schooling and opportunities. Byrd grew up near Richmond at a family estate called Edgewood. He had a blessed upbringing, but his parents encouraged discipline, learning, and responsibility from a young age. He was interested in mechanics, navigation, and nature. He loved exploring and showed curiosity about maps, technology, and adventure, foreshadowing his later career in exploration. Byrd attended Episcopal High School in Alexandria, a prestigious boarding school where he excelled academically. After he finished high school, he wanted to pursue his passion in adventure and exploration, so he enrolled in the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1908 at 19. His time at the Academy exposed him to navigation, leadership, and technical skills, forming the foundation for his future expeditions. While aviation was still in its infancy, Byrd became fascinated by airplanes and their potential for exploration. He attended lectures and demonstrations about flight, and his technical skills allowed him to understand and operate early aircraft, which he later used to explore uncharted land. Byrd graduated in 1912 as a naval officer ready to serve in the United States Navy. At graduation, he was recognized as a capable officer with exceptional technical and leadership skills, setting the stage for his assignments in the future. After graduation, Byrd was commissioned as an ensign, which is the lowest rank in the Navy. His earlier assignments were typical. He served aboard battleships and other naval vessels and learned how to manage men, equipment, and large voyages. He proved competent and reliable, but nothing yet suggested he would become world famous. That change would come because of something unexpected. In the year 1916, Byrd suffered a severe ankle injury while aboard a ship. His injury was serious enough that he was declared medically unfit for normal sea duty. For many officers, this might have ended their careers at sea. Instead, one door closed while another one opened. Since Byrd could no longer serve full sea duty, Byrd began working in naval aviation, which was still a new field at the time. During this time, he became involved in training pilots and studying aerial navigation, something very few people in the world fully understood. Planes were fragile, unreliable, and difficult to navigate with high mortality rates, but Byrd knew this type of transportation would be very important in the future, because planes are able to cover more ground in less time than walking. But this chapter had to wait because in 1917 the US would enter World War I. Since Byrd wasn't capable of fighting, he helped with logistics such as working on improving long-distance flight navigation and expanding his experience working with naval aerial navigation. After the war ended in 1918, Byrd continued to focus on specializing in aerial navigation. This also helped him develop long flight techniques, requiring less stops and allowing him to go further each time. An example of this is when Byrd adapted a marine sextant navigation for airplanes. A sextant is a navigation instrument used to measure the angle between a celestial body such as the sun, moon, or stars and the horizon to determine a vessel's latitude and longitude at sea. But Byrd took this device and made it a bubble sextant, which creates an artificial horizon so pilots could take stars and sun sightings even when the real horizon wasn't visible. This was crucial over the ocean and especially in polar regions where landmarks were absent. Another technique Byrd improved on was drift measurement. Byrd used drift meters to measure how crosswinds pushed the aircraft off course. Pilots would look at the ground or see surface patterns through a sighting device to calculate drift angle. This helped correct headings in real time. He also incorporated early radio navigation methods by using radio signals from ground stations to determine direction. He would become one of the Navy's top experts in navigating aircraft over open ocean. This was a big deal at the time because planes had no GPS, limited instruments, and unreliable engines. Navigating over water or ice was extremely dangerous. In 1926, Byrd organized a private expedition to attempt their first flight over the North Pole. There were many reasons why Byrd wanted to do this, but one of the reasons for this expedition was to prove airplanes could be used for polar exploration. The Arctic was difficult and dangerous to cross by ship or sled. Byrd believed aviation was the future of exploration. A successful flight would give more legitimacy to aviation exploration. But more intriguing was this was one of the last charted territories on Earth still unknown to humans. Byrd wanted to be the first to document this strange land. He flew the Josephine forward with another pilot named Floyd Bennett. They took off from Spitsbergen, which is now part of Norway, and the next events are questioned by historians because some of them say that Byrd didn't actually reach the North Pole. This will be about Byrd's personal account of the expedition. On May 9th, 1926, both Byrd and Floyd took off and reported flight time, about 15 hours and 44 minutes round trip. Byrd announced they had reached the North Pole based on celestial navigation observations and dead reckoning calculations, which is basically a navigational technique of determining an aircraft's current position by projecting a previously known position using calculated speed, time, heading, and wind factors. This was used because visual ground references were unavailable. The reason why some historians question this is because of Byrd's journal. In the 90s, a version of Byrd's flight diary resurfaced. It included navigation notes and calculations. Some calculations appeared crossed out or revised. Certain figures suggested that the aircraft may have turned back before reaching the exact pole, but this is just speculation. The diary does not contain any clear statements saying that they failed to reach it. Interpretation depends on how one analyzes the numbers. Byrd later described this expedition in his book Skyward. In his account, he stated that he encountered an oil leak during the flight. They carefully calculated their position using sun observations. They circled at what he determined was the North Pole, dropped an American flag, then returned to Spitsbergen. Byrd constantly maintained in public statements and writings that they had reached the North Pole. If we look into the flight log, Byrd said about halfway north he reported an oil leak in one of the engines. The oil pressure concerns caused them to monitor the engine closely. They debated whether to turn back or continue. Byrd wrote that the leak did not worsen critically, so they continued toward their calculated objective before turning south. There was no record of engine failure. All three engines were operating when they landed. Once they did land, Byrd described what he saw, which was a continuous expanse of white packed ice, pressure ridges and cracks in the ice, and no visible land once fully over the polar sea. Byrd emphasized that there were no landmarks, and navigation relied entirely on instruments and celestial readings. The sun moved in a complete circle around them in the sky due to the polar daylight conditions. It is important to know that from the air, the North Pole would look visibly identical to the surrounding ice. There is no physical marker at the pole. Confirmation depended entirely on navigation calculations. The weather conditions that day were clear skies during parts of the flight and some haze near the horizon. Weather reports from the region confirmed the Arctic winds could significantly affect ground speed. On the flight back, Byrd recorded tailwinds on the return leg, which would increase ground speed. They safely landed back at Spitsbergen approximately 15 hours and 44 minutes total flight time. Observers on the ground confirmed the departure and landing times. News of his successful flight were transmitted quickly to Europe and the United States. They were widely celebrated as have reaching the North Pole. Byrd received congratulations from U.S. officials. He was promoted in a rank within the U.S. Navy, and he began gaining major public attention as a national hero. In 1927, Byrd was feeling optimistic about his skills as a flyer and decided to attempt a non-stop transatlantic flight from U.S. to France. Byrd and his crew flew the aircraft America from New York. The America was a 3-engine four-car tri-motor. On board, the aircraft had multiple crew members, loaded with extra fuel and equipped with a radio and navigation instruments. The extra weight would become a serious issue later on. Soon after departure, the crew encountered weather difficulties such as thick fog and turbulence. Since the sky wasn't clear, it made celestial navigation nearly impossible, forcing them to rely on heavy instruments, which were not highly reliable at the time. They began to realize that they were burning more fuel than expected. This created a growing fear that they might not reach Paris. But another problem quickly appeared. Oil pressure concerns arose that would affect the engine's ability to properly function. Because of the poor visibility, they were unsure of their exact position, and at times they drifted off their intended course. When they finally reached Europe, they were not exactly sure where they were going to land. This added to fuel concerns and stress. This caused an emergency landing. Realizing they could not safely reach Paris, they decided to land along the coast near Vers-sur-Mer. The landing was rough, the plane overshot the beach, and it was damaged. The nose dug into the sand, but more importantly, all crew members survived. After this flight, Byrd took some time to recover and find his next adventure. This time Byrd had his eyes on the south towards Antarctica. Byrd organized and privately funded a large expedition, established a base camp called Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf. He bought aircraft, tractors, radio equipment, and scientific instruments. On November 29, 1929, Byrd and a crew flew over the South Pole. The flight was well documented. It made him one of the most famous explorers in the world. Byrd's second Antarctica expedition, which was in 1933, was very different from his first. Instead of focusing mainly on flights, this expedition emphasized long-term scientific research, meteorology, and inland exploration of this uncharted territory. Some of the goals were continuous weather observation at this location, and scientific data collection such as geology and magnetism. He also wanted to create maps of unexplored areas and test equipment for extreme cold conditions. Byrd wanted Antarctica to be studied scientifically, not just explored symbolically. This would take some time, so Byrd and his team built a new base called Little America II on the Ross Ice Shelf. This base included radio rooms, sleeping quarters, storage, and laboratories. It was also supplied by ship during the brief Arctic summer, where ships could pass through the water. The most significant event of this expedition was Byrd's decision to spend the winter alone at a remote station called Advanced Base. This was about 120 miles from Little America II. It was isolated, inland, and exposed to extreme cold. The reason why he did this was to collect uninterrupted winter weather data and to study atmospheric condition during the Antarctic night. He believed personal isolation would reduce interference and allow continuous readings. When winter reached the Arctic, it was brutal. Temperatures were often below negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That wasn't the end. There was a complete darkness for months. This is caused by the tilt of the Earth's axis as it orbits the sun. During the southern hemisphere's winter, March to September, this tilt causes the South Pole to face away from the sun, keeping it entirely in Earth's shadow, resulting in 24-hour darkness. And during this time, Byrd experienced severe windstorms and snow accumulation around the base. One of the most dangerous events that happened to Byrd at this time was monoxide poisoning. Byrd used a stove for heat inside the base. Poor ventilation caused carbon monoxide to build up. He became gradually poisoned. Some of the symptoms he experienced was weakness, dizziness, severe headaches, and mental confusion. Because he was alone, help was not coming soon. Eventually, men from Little America II realized something was wrong when Byrd's messages weren't reaching them, and he wasn't sounding like himself. They made a dangerous rescue trip through extreme conditions to reach him. He survived, but his condition was serious. During the months alone, Byrd recorded deep loneliness, hallucination-like sensory distortions caused by darkness and isolation, and intense reflection on life. However, he also described a feeling of spiritual clarity and appreciation for silence and solitude. Before Byrd's winter at Advanced Base, very little continuous Arctic winter weather data existed. Most expeditions only observed summer conditions. He measured humidity, barometric pressure, and storm frequency. His data confirmed that Antarctica functions as a major cold air source for global circulation. He also provided data on persistent high-pressure systems over the polar plateau. He improved understanding of southern hemisphere winter atmospheric patterns. This helped meteorologists better model global weather circulation. One of the most quoted ideas from his writings came from this period. Quote, "Half the confusion in the world comes from not knowing how little we need." End quote. Byrd, realizing that many worries of modern life seemed unnecessary when survival depended on basic needs, such as things simple like food, water, and shelter. He felt that isolation stripped life down to its essentials. During long periods of darkness and silence, it does something to the human mind. Byrd wrote about feeling connected to something larger than himself. He described moments where the quiet Antarctic environment gave him a sense of profound stillness. Quote, "The universe seems nearer here than anywhere else on the earth." End quote. Looking at the stars, he felt the Arctic landscape created a powerful awareness of nature's scale compared to everything else in life. Because most people are too busy trying to stay afloat, whether that be through work or something else. People don't see the bigger picture. They are too distracted by everyday life. Despite the hardship, Byrd concluded that solitude had value. He wrote that modern life rarely allows people to experience true quiet or reflection. He believed that isolation allowed him to think more clearly about his purpose in life. This experience reinforced his belief in self-reliance and inner calmness. After everything was said and done, Byrd's book about reflection and balance in his life. His book alone emphasized the psychological side of exploration. The experience deepened his appreciation for cooperation and human companionship. But during this time, Byrd described strange psychological phenomenon. During the winter of 34 at Advanced Base, Byrd experienced several psychological effects that scientists now recognize as common during long-term polar isolation. Modern Antarctic researchers and astronauts in training study many of the same phenomena today. Without normal daylight cycles, Byrd found that his sense of time became unreliable. You have to remember, winters in Antarctica are extremely dangerous. The sun does not rise for months, and the darkness is constant. Byrd wrote that days sometimes felt extremely long, while other periods passed quickly without him realizing it. Modern psychologists call it the circadian rhythm disruption, which occurs when your internal body clocks fall out of sync with external clues like light and dark cycles. Advanced Base was incredibly quiet and visually empty. There were no plants, animals, or people. Byrd described the silence as overwhelming. Quote, "The silence is so intense that it seems to press upon the ears." End quote. Today, some scientists recognize that environments with low sensory input can cause the brain to hide internal thoughts and emotions. But on the other hand, Byrd also described moments of intense appreciation for nature's phenomenon, such as the aurora borealis and star-filled skies. Another possible psychological effect is the third man factor. Many explorers in extreme environments report a strange sensation that another presence is nearby, even when they are alone. This has been reported by polar explorers, mountaineers, and shipwreck survivors. Byrd did not clearly describe a fully third presence, but he did write about intense feeling of being alone in a few way humans have experienced. But isolation removed most daily interactions. Byrd wrote that this allowed him to reflect deeply on materialism, personal discipline, and nature's power. After Byrd was rescued, he was brought back to main base. Doctors and crew monitored his health. He gradually regained strength, but his physical recovery took weeks. Carbon monoxide poisoning can leave lingering weaknesses. Although he improved, he remained physically exhausted for some time. Even after the crisis, the expedition continued its research program. Aircraft and ground parties explored surrounding areas of the Ross Ice Shelf and nearby mountains. Byrd remained involved in leadership and planning, though he was not working under the same extreme isolation anymore. The expedition expanded geographical knowledge of Antarctica. They conducted aerial photographs of previously unmapped regions. They also used ground explorations. This involved tractors, dog sleds, and surveyors. They also looked at mountain ranges and ice shelf structures. As the Antarctic summer returned and sea conditions allowed ships to approach, supplies and personnel were prepared for departure. Equipment and scientific data were packed. The expedition began returning north. By 1935, the expedition officially ended. Most of the members returned to the United States. Even after nearly dying during the second expedition, Byrd was still determined to continue Antarctic exploration. He began organizing a new expedition in the late 1930s. This became the third Byrd Antarctic expedition. This expedition was partly sponsored by the U.S. government. The goals of this expedition was to further scientific research of this land. They also wanted to map unknown regions and establish an American presence in Antarctica. The expedition helped establish U.S. territorial claims in some regions, though Antarctica later became internationally governed. During this time, there were two bases, East and West Base. West Base was located on the Ross Ice Shelf, northeast of the previous Little America, the second base, and was commanded by Dr. Paul Seipel. East Base was located on Singleton Island in Margarita Bay on the Antarctic Peninsula, commanded by Richard B. Black. But this expedition was short-lived. Once the outbreak of World War II happened, the U.S. government ordered the expedition to end early, so resources and personnel could be redirected toward the war. The bases were closed and the expedition returned home. During the war, Byrd served as a senior officer in the Navy. His experience in extreme conditions made him valuable in several ways. He helped plan with operations in cold climates, developing equipment for polar conditions. Polar regions were strategically important during the war because aircraft routes and weather patterns affected military operations. During and after the war, Byrd's career in the Navy continued to advance. He eventually reached the rank of Rear Admiral. After the war, interest in Antarctica increased again. Byrd would soon lead one of the largest expeditions ever attempted, which came in the late 1940s. This was called Operation High Jump. The U.S. Navy launched this expedition in 1946 for several reasons. According to naval planning documents, the goals were to train military personnel for polar operations, test equipment in extreme cold conditions, establish and maintain Antarctic research bases, extend U.S. knowledge of Antarctic geography, develop aerial mapping techniques. These goals reflected the early Cold War concerns that polar regions could be used for military routes. The scale of this operation was about 4,700 people, 13 vessels including aircraft, destroyers, icebreakers, cargo ships, and submarines, around 30 aircraft including helicopter, reconnaissance planes, and flying boats. This scale made it more like a military operation than a traditional exploration expedition. The fleet was divided into several groups, the first one being Center Group, led by aircraft carrier U.S. Philippine. Then you had Eastern and Western groups. These groups explored different sections of Antarctica's coastline and interior. The expedition accomplished several scientific tasks, such as aircraft photography. This was done by taking pictures of large sections of Antarctica that had never been mapped before. Thousands of aerial photographs were taken. Many of these images helped improve Antarctic maps for decades. They also tested equipment in cold weather. This research helped improve polar military technology. Despite its size, the expedition faced serious problems. Antarctica's condition proved extremely difficult. Strong winds, blizzards, and shifting ice made it dangerous for explorers to conduct their research. A notable incident happened when a PBM Marina seaplane crashed during a reconnaissance flight. 3 crew members died. This was the expedition's most serious loss. Originally, Operation High Jump was planned to last 8 to 9 months. However, it only ended after 2 months. Ending early was a practical decision to avoid being trapped in winter ice. Byrd served as overall expedition leader, though much of the operation command was handled by Navy officers. His responsibilities included planning the mission, overseeing scientific objectives, and coordinating aerial reconnaissance. By this time, Byrd had become more of an administrator and a strategist rather than a field explorer. After the expedition, Byrd gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper. He reportedly warned that in future wars, aircraft might be able to fly, quote, from pole to pole at incredible speeds, end quote. But there is more to the story than what is on the surface. Operation High Jump would later become the subject of many theories. After the expedition, Richard Byrd gave an interview to journalist Lee Van Aja while aboard the command ship. The interview was published in the Chilean newspaper called The Mercury on March 5, 1947. Byrd reportedly warned that the United States must prepare for attacks by aircraft that could travel from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Most historians often interpret this as a warning about long-range bombers or missiles, while some other people interpret this as Byrd trying to tell us something else. The expedition ending early was another source of theories that something unexpected happened, but the official report says that the reason for it ending early was due to harsh weather and damage to aircraft. After Operation High Jump, Byrd remained one of the most influential figures in polar exploration. The final phase of his life focused less on dramatic expeditions and more on organizing large scientific programs in Antarctica. After returning from Antarctica, Byrd remained an important figure in the U.S. Navy. He advised the government on polar strategy and exploration. His experience in Antarctica made him one of the world's leading experts on polar operations. The growing tension of the early Cold War meant the U.S. government was increasingly interested in these regions. By the early 1950s, scientists were planning a large international research project called the International Geophysical Year. The program aimed to study Earth's major systems, including weather patterns, Earth's magnetic field, and glaciers. Antarctica was considered one of the most important places for this research. Because of his experience, Byrd became a key planner for the American role. To support the upcoming scientific research, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Deep Freeze. This operation was designed to build permanent research stations that would transport scientists, equipment, and establish long-term logistical support in Antarctica. Byrd served as a senior advisor for the project. Operation Deep Freeze led to the construction of several major research stations. One of the most important was McMurdo Station. This station became the largest Antarctic research base, a central hub for scientific work on the continent. Byrd's early expeditions helped determine where the bases could be safely established. Despite being older and less physically active, Byrd made one last trip to Antarctica in 1956. During this visit, he inspected the new research stations and observed the beginning of large-scale scientific work on the continent. He saw how Antarctic exploration had shifted from heroic expeditions to permanent research. This was essentially the product of his lifelong work. On March 11, 1957, Byrd died in Boston at the age of 68. This happened just before the International Geophysical Year began. In his death, he left behind a large legacy of exploration records, scientific observations, books, and personal writings. He believed Antarctica played a major role in Earth's systems. He believed studying Antarctica would help understand global climate and atmospheric circulation. Near the end of his life, he warned that Antarctica might hold important resources and knowledge that would tell us more about the planet we live on. In a famous interview, he said that Antarctica was, quote, the last great unexplored land on Earth, end quote. Richard Byrd is currently buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Thank you for watching. Do you think the conspiracy theories around Operation High Jump have any value to them? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this type of content, subscribe for future videos.